So hopefully I made it nice and big and everyone can see. Now you can see. Okay, great. Great. So I was thinking like where to start, and I mentioned like we're gonna start with categories, but it maps so nicely on also starting with the first time any human ever slept. Because even in that sleep, we already begin to have different words to describe sleep. So the first time Adam sleeps, Adam Harishon sleeps, it's before Eve is ever even invented, or before and during, all in one sleeping session. Because what happens is, Vayapel Hashem Elokim tardema al ha'adam vayishan. So God casts a deep sleep upon the human, and he sleeps. So we have tardema and vayishan, two different roots, radam and yashan, to describe sleeping. So what's the difference? What does it mean that Adam did both of those things? And what's the purpose of his sleep? So we get a sense immediately of what the purpose of his sleep was. We get to figure that out just from the verses themselves. So here's the second half of that pasuk. Vayikach echad mitzalotav vayiskor basar tachtena. So God took one of his sides, one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh at that site. So God here, I think my grandfather uses this language, Professor Nachum Sarna used this language in his Torah commentary. God here is the anesthesiologist. God and the surgeon all at once, an entire surgical team all in one divinity. Right, so Hashem puts Adam to sleep. Adam successfully sleeps, the anesthesia works, and God takes out a rib or a side and closes behind him. So doesn't leave the closure to like a resident or whatever. God's self does the surgery and the anesthesia top to bottom. And then from that piece that God took from Adam's body, Vayiven Hashem Elokim et hatzela asher lakach min ha'adam leisha. So God fashioned the side that he had taken from the human into a woman, Vivieha el ha'adam, and he brought her to Adam, or the human, the one and only, until the woman exists, until the Isha exists. So this is the creation of the Isha. Also, like, what a nightmare. You fall asleep. It's also the first time he ever fell asleep, so that feels like that might have been scary in and of itself, except that maybe he like wasn't conscious of even falling asleep. And then in that time he loses a body part, which is like even that in and of itself speaks to some of the terror of being asleep. Right? Sometimes when we can't sleep, it's because we're afraid. Sometimes even when small children can't sleep, it's because their brain has newly taught them all the things that there are to be afraid of. And they realize their vulnerability when they're asleep. And it is really the case. We are extremely vulnerable when we're asleep. We're going to see another story about sleep being a huge vulnerability later on tonight. We're going to see it from King David and Shaul. And so like even sleep being a military vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, crazy things can happen to us, right? Like God could take away, or someone else could take away a body part. And that's in fact what happens during surgery, right? Like we pretend like surgery, I feel like every class I end up talking about medicine somehow. Okay, sorry. Like we pretend like surgery is just normal, but surgery is only normal and not an act of horrific violence because of like the lines and customs that we've drawn around it, right? Like if someone who wasn't a surgeon in an operating room attempting to heal you, that you like cut open your body and took an organ out, that would be mutilation, like a real act of violence. And the line between that and surgery is only like aesthetics and intention, which are not small things, but like the actions involved might be identical, and one would be a horrific act of violence and one is considered an act of healing. And the fact that those actions could be identical is just like a really jarring thing. And I think very much the same thing is true about healing, like about sleep, is that like it's one action and it makes us incredibly vulnerable to violence, to damage our property. Like we're not aware, right? That's why different animals to account for that vulnerability differently. Like some animals can sleep with just half their brain on at the time so that they are not the level of vulnerable that humans are when we sleep. But at the same time, that exact thing that makes us so vulnerable also means that also protects us, meaning Hashem put Adam to sleep not to make him vulnerable to assault, but to make it possible for Adam to have a surgery that he could survive and that wouldn't be painful. So we're going to see the Radak talk about this in a second, but that's what the Chizkuni says. Ve'apel tarzima al ha'adam lefi apshat chas hakadosh baruch hu al adam rishon. According to the simple reading of the verses, Hashem had mercy on Adam, shelo lahachivo, so that he wouldn't feel injury, he wouldn't feel hurt. Lefichach hipil alav tarzima. Therefore, he made him unconscious. So that unconsciousness that makes us so vulnerable to damage and assault, at the flip side of that coin is that it's also protective. It also can be healing, right? No one looks at anesthesiologists and says, oh, like you made him vulnerable, you're a piece of the assault. Like, no, the anesthesiologist is what makes the surgery tolerable, right? So, but it's all a piece of that same sort of two sides of a coin that are so different from each other between like assault and healing. The anesthesia also can play both roles, right? Because in some ways, the anesthesiologist is just the guy holding you down while someone else is beating you up. Like that's the other way to think about it. But here we're seeing Hashem doing it in the language of Chizkuni, Chas HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's doing it as an act of mercy. Okay, so here's the Radak, and the Radak is going to really dig in and ask questions about why do we need Tardema Vayishan? So you could say, well, Tardema is a noun, Vayishan is a verb, but it could be also like it could have said, and Hashem caused Adam lahiradim. Like there is such a thing in the Torah as, or in Tanakh as causing radam in verb form. So why do we need both of these things? Also, like if God casts upon you a tardema, surely you are asleep. So why does it need to tell us that it worked? That's also very strange. Okay, so here's the Radak. The Radak is gonna kind of give us some language introduction. So first of all, he's going to talk about 3 different words for sleep. So, and we're going to get more into Tanuma later today, like in section 2 of this shiur, okay? So Vayapel, okay, I do not want your corrections. Vayapel Tardema, the Radak says Tardema yoter mi shena. Tardema describes a sleep deeper than shena, which is ordinary sleep. Shena yoter mi tnuma, and shena is a deeper sleep than a tnuma. So we already have this 3-part ranking: Tardema, shena, tnuma. And so you might think about it as like, we don't have a separate English word for a deep sleep. Like we would just say deep sleep. But the idea that in Hebrew, it actually gets an entirely different cherish, that like deep sleep is really categorized and conceptualized so differently, I think is actually interesting. Like maybe the closest thing you would get to it is like Tardema is like being comatose. There we have a different word for it in English. You don't see that as a translation often for tardema, but I would maybe propose it actually. So we have being comatose and then being asleep, and then let's call it tnuman, napping for now. But again, all these translations are always just approximations, that like these words have their own feels to them because sleep is such a they're all connected. Like what's the line between a deep sleep and just a regular sleep? Well, in your regular sleep overnight, you go through all these different cycles, and sometimes you're really deeply asleep and sometimes you're not so deeply asleep, and whatever it is, right? So and remember all the things we know about sleep, like REM cycles and all that stuff. Like we cannot impose that necessarily onto these texts. That's not fair. Things that we've discovered through like modern neuroscience. We can assume that they know the lived experience of that and have theorized about it, but we can't assume that they, and we can't hold them at fault for not knowing like what REM sleep is or something like that. So anyways, okay, so we have these three words, three categories, tardima, sheina, tinima. And then the Radak says, "Ve'ipil Hashem tardima alav k'dei shelo yargish ha'ka'ev b'kach to'achad mitzvah." So that's similar to what we saw the Chizkuni say. Hashem made Adam comatose so that he wouldn't feel the pain when one of his ribs was taken. The Radak says, by the way, like God is capable of doing this differently. If God wanted to take away your rib and have you not feel it and you be awake, just to be clear, Kadosh Baruch Hu is capable of that. Kadosh Baruch Hu could do it, but we don't really like having miracles done in that way. Hashem only does miracles when miracles are necessary. V'hapalada tardima ena mofi v'chidush ki pa'amim rabim yardei ma'adam b'shenato. And the type of making someone go into a deep sleep, well, that's not miraculous. Hashem didn't need to do such a miracle. That type of sleep can happen to people just when they're normally asleep, and then they fall into a really, really deep sleep, suggests the Radak. So, it's funny, we read it now with a fuller understanding of like anesthesiology or like a picture in our head of what that can look like. But obviously they didn't have that, and they still understood that there can be a deep enough sleep that you wouldn't be experiencing pain, which is really interesting. Okay, so then the Radak asks, why is it Vayapal Tardima, but then also Vayishan? So Vayishan, Achar Shamar Tardima. So when it says he slept, after it says he was put into a deep sleep, Leodia, it's to let you know, Ki Tardima Italo Mitchila, Ad Shenilkacha Mimenu Atzala V'nisgar Lo Achisaron Basa. So the deep sleep that was there from the beginning, once the rib was being taken and the hole was being like sewn up after that surgery. But then after he was closed, but after that, he then just slept a normal sleep until he found comfort and respite from his suffering, from his pain. V'afshar, says the Radak, this part is, I set this up already, but the Radak is one of the only people who actually talk about this. He says, V'afshar sheshina hazot haita hashina harishona sheishan achari shenotzar. It's possible this is the first sleep, actually, that Adam ever had. Ki b'yom hashishi hayu kol hasipurim shesiper katuv bo ad shenoldu lo habanim because actually we think about the sixth day and we're like, oh, the creation of animals and people, but actually like so much happened on the sixth day. On the sixth day is from the creation of man up through them having children. That Breshit Rabbah that they're citing there, it's not our topic. I did talk about it in the classes I was giving around the Yamim Noraim this year. It's an amazing Breshit Rabbah that goes into like, okay, on Rosh Hashanah, like what all actually happened that day. It's really like worth your time to check out, or I guess you can watch those talks also and go into our archives. But what the Radak is saying is that when we're in Breshit Bet, even so far in as verses 21 and 22, we're actually still on the sixth day, which means like man was created. He saw that he was alone. Hashem put him to sleep, took out a rib and made Eve all on that first day. And so it could really be actually that this was the first time he ever slept. And the first time he ever slept, it wasn't even nighttime sleep. It was just so exhausting to be created. And by the way, we totally know this, like babies are born and they just like, they're awake for an hour and then they pass right out for like a really long time because it's so exhausting coming into the world. And And that is, and maybe that's what happens here also with Adam, that actually even before it's nighttime at the end of the sixth day or the beginning of Shabbat, he already has had both a deep sleep and then a lighter sleep during which he was able to recover. Okay, so that is the Radak, and now we've been introduced well to the idea of Tardema or like Radam versus Yashan.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Do you have a question?
So Sarah Weinstein just had a kind of question comment. So wouldn't Tardema be considered the state of being unconscious, which is not the same as sleep, since you can be woken up from sleep, but not from unconsciousness, I guess, like by an external stimulus.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're gonna get more into it. But I think that's a really good assessment of what Tardema is versus Vaishan. And we're gonna see more as we go. It might get a little bit complicated. And it's also worth saying, like, these words might not be as separate as we wish they were. So like we have to hold that, and we're trying to figure out what the differences are. And I think we do need to figure out what the difference is, particularly when we're reading Breshit and we're seeing both of those terms used in one pasuk and there's a redundancy. So that's part of what's motivating the Radak to say in one of these you don't feel any pain and you can't be woken up, and one of these is more like normal sleep where you can be woken up, you would feel pain if there was pain, but it's still restorative. And if you're in pain and you go into like normal sleep, you don't feel it. But if you were in normal sleep and someone took your rib out, you would feel it. So like maybe one of the distinctions between these types of sleep is actually like your pain tolerance or your tolerance for change in status also while you're in that type of sleep. So it's not necessarily that you can't have yashan type of sleep while you have pain, but it's that if the pain changes or like gets worse, it will wake you up. Versus in a situation of tardema, like crazy things could happen. God could take out your rib and you wouldn't even know. Okay. Thanks for the thumbs up. Okay. So let's look at this text from Breshit Rabbah. It's like a little bit of, it's like a midrash, so it's a little bit all over the place, but it's cool anyways. So Vayapel Hashem Elokim Tardema, so that's our pasuk. So Rav says there's three types of Tardema. There's Tardemat Shena, Tardemat Nevuah, the Tardemat Marmita. So there's slumber of sleep, slumber of prophecy, and the slumber of a trance. So then he's going to say, what are each of these? So, and bring three examples. So the first one is Tardemat Shena is our case. So it's just this like really deep sleep. Vayapal Hashem Elokim Tardema al ha'adam vayishan. So Hashem put Adam into this Tardema and then he slept. So I just want to point out that this midrash, like, does it agree with the Radak or does it disagree with the Radak? So it seems like it disagrees with the Radak. So the Radak tries to draw this really clear distinction. The verse uses both of those terms because there were actually two phases going on here. And here in Breshit Rabbah, we have Rav saying, no, there's just different kinds of Tardema. So the verse says Vayishan, so that you'll know what type of Tardema it was, so that you'll know what type of experience Adam was having. Otherwise, you might have thought that Adam was asleep. God made him asleep and he had a prophecy, and that was the point of the sleep. And the real thing was like, no, the point of it was just for him to be so deeply asleep that he could undergo this surgery, but not because the surgery was like a prophetic vision. And the reason why that might be confusing is, let's see, because we have another Tardema Nafla. So there's another type of Tardema, which is prophetic. And this is from Brit Ben Abitarim. I didn't bring it for you, but what happens is the sun goes down, the sun is setting, the Tardema Nafla. It's that really same language. That deep sleep fell upon Abram, and then he's shown the stars of the sky and the sand of the, and the sand on the ground, and your people will be as numerous as whatever. And that is a tardima of prophecy. So maybe the thing is like there's a unifying experience between the place you go like in your brain when you're in having the tardima of sleep versus the tardima of prophecy, or from the outside those two things look the same, but really what's being accomplished during that time is totally different. So for Adam, nothing was being accomplished during that time other than numbness. But for Avram, he was having this like totally transformative prophetic experience where he was a covenantally prophetic experience where God was promising him a future and a child and all these different things that had so far eluded him. So that's a different version, I think, really, than the Radak's distinction between Tardema and Yishan. Here, it's more of a distinction between Vayishan and Nevuah. And there's a third type of Tardema, and that is this funny word, marmita. Tardema marmita, so a trance. So we're gonna see this I brought for you in Shmuel Aleph. Ein ro'eh ve'ein yodea ve'ein mekitz. So it's not just that, okay, most people sleeping are ein ro'eh, they can't see, but ein yodea, they're not, they don't know. There's like something, there's like a lack of there's not just maybe we could say like sleeping is like 0, prophecy is 100, and maybe this is like negative 100 in terms of like what type of experience is happening on the inside for someone who's in this tardema, maybe like coma or unconscious state, and they're impossible to wake up, but in mekitz, because they're all asleep, ki kulam yishinim, ki tardimat Hashem nafla alehem, because this tardima from God fell upon them. So again, this idea that God sends tardima to people, Adam, Avram, and now we're about to see Shaul. And then, so that's all Rav's opinion, and the rabbi, and we're going to look in a second at that Shmuel Aleph text, but the Rabbanah and the rabbis add in an extra one, Tardema shel shtut, and they bring that from Isaiah 29, for the Lord poured upon you a spirit of deep slumber, ki nasach aleichem Hashem ruach tardema. So that is a slumber of foolishness, which somehow is different from just sleep, different from prophecy, and different from a trance. And then just like a fun or interesting little addition here. So Rabbi Chanina Bar Yitzchak says there are 3 shalosh novelot hen. There are 3 microcosms. Novelet mitah shena. So sleep is a microcosm of death. That's a really important idea. We're going to come back to that big time, not today. But sleep as a microcosm of death is like a really, really, really important idea. And liturgically, it's like a really important idea in terms of like what we say in the morning when we wake up after having slept. And again, you know, what I mentioned before about sleep being scary, sleep being a vulnerability, that's really touching at that. But also the experience of an outsider. You look at someone, you're like, are they sleeping or are they dead? Like even colloquially, oh, he's dead to the world. You know, like that doesn't mean that someone is dead. It means that they're really deeply asleep, dead to the world. So this connection between sleep and death feels really strong. Like, how do you know if someone's sleeping if they're alive? Like only because they're breathing. Okay, breathing's not such a small thing. Obviously, breathing is huge, but still, it feels like it's more difficult to tell if a sleeping person is alive than like me going like this. So, so there's an element of death and sleep. Again, we'll come back to that a lot. Novelet nevuah halom. So a dream is a microcosm of prophecy, and novelet haolam haba Shabbat. And Shabbat is a microcosm of the world to come. That's also like Me'in Olam Haba. It's a very common idea. But what was interesting to me about all of these is that actually they all touch on sleep. So if you think of Shabbat as like Menucha, right? That connection between Shabbat and Menucha, which comes so kind of naturally and so easily, the connection between Shabbat and Shabbat being about rest. And then you have sleep being, you know, sleep and death, dreams and prophecy, and Shabbat and the world to come. And all of a sudden you have a bunch of keywords that are all sort of connected to each other and all related to sleep in some way. Obviously, sleep and death is the most obvious one, but like dreams are something that happen during sleep. I should have mentioned at the top, but I didn't. We're really going to talk about dreams only like here and there. There's so much dream material that like we would have to do a totally different thing about that. And I actually think that most of the time when people teach Torah about sleep, what they really teach about is dreams. And there's, I think, so much interesting material that's not about dreams that I want to focus on that, even though obviously dreams are so wild and so crazy and so interesting. But yeah, I just wanted to like caveat that we're not really going to be talking about dreams so much. But dreams are obviously connected to sleep, and we just saw Tardema as being connected to Nevuah also. So we're just sort of sketching out like an ecosystem here a little bit of all these related or interconnected things. Because also when we talk about Olam Haba, the world to come, that's also a little bit connected to death. And so sleep, death, prophecy, dreaming, the world to come, Shabbat, like it's all sort of like one set of ideas and terms. Okay, so I wanted us to see this text from Shmuel Aleph. It's really fun. We have, again, a few different terms for sleep that come up within it. And I think what it really emphasizes is the sleep as a time when other people can take advantage of you, sleep as a time of vulnerability. And that's sort of, I mean, that's definitely what the story is about. And then we get to see King David, like, or I guess not yet King David, not taking advantage of that, and he comes off big, I think. Okay, so Vayavo David v'Avishai el ha'am Lila. So David and Avishai approached the troops by night. V'nei Shaul shochiv Yashin b'ma'agal, and he finds Shaul fast asleep inside the barricade. V'chanito me'ucha ba'aretz mirashotav, and his spear is like stuck in the ground near his head. V'avner va'am shokvim sevivotav, and Abner and the troops are sleeping all around him. And Avishai says to David, Sigar Elokim hayomed oivecha biadacha. God handed this to you. Like, wow, this is amazing. We've just been served these people on a platter. V'ata akanuna b'chani v'aretz pam achad v'lo ashanelo. He says, let me pin him to the ground with a single thrust of my spear. I won't have to strike him twice. Like Shaul is about to be dead meat, says Avishai. And David says to Avishai, Al tashchitehu. I see what you're seeing, but don't do him any violence. Kimi shalach yado b'mashiach Hashem v'nikah. No one can lay hands on the Lord's anointed and kind of walk away innocent from that interaction. Like you can't, I see that you physically could do that, but we are not allowed to do that. That's not how Shaul is allowed to be defeated by us. Vayomer David Chai Hashem, right? David takes a vow as the Lord lives. Ki'im Hashem Yegafe, or not exactly a vow here, but like for emphasis, like as the Lord lives, Ki'im Hashem Yegafenu, the Lord Himself is going to strike him down. O Yomo Yavo B'mi, or his day, his time will come and he will die. O B'milchama Yerid V'nispa, or he's going to go down into battle and he'll perish. Chalila li me Hashem mishloach yadi v'mashiach Hashem, but God forbid that I lay a hand on God's anointed, but here's what we're going to do. To show how vulnerable Shaul was, let's take his spear and we're going to take his water. And again, it's described, this is now the second time, as being like right by his head. Like Shaul thought, like, I will put my spear into the ground 2 seconds from my head. If someone comes by, I'll be protected because my spear is right here. Like I'm sleeping armed, like ready to rock. And that is not the case. And David and Avishai take the spear and the water. Or here it says, right, David does that from the head of Shaul. A third time it says that it was from his head, and they go. And no one's, and this is our verse that we saw quoted above, No one saw, knew, woke up, all remained asleep. A deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. So the Midrash understands this to be something different than what Adam was. But if you just saw this verse and you saw Kitar Dimat Hashem Nafla, you would be like, cool, Adam, Aram. But the Midrash, I think, wants to say, no, like each of those three cases, Rav wants to say, each of those three cases is different. It's all a tardima. They all look comatose. They all look unconscious, but there's actually a really different thing happening to each of them. For Adam, he's asleep. For Avram, he's getting prophecy. And for Shaul, he's in some kind of trance. And that's the one I understand the least. Like, what's the difference between what's happening to Adam and what's happening to Shaul? You can say like the outcome shows the difference. Like the point for Adam was that he should be able to undergo a surgery, versus the point for Shaul was just that he isn't woken up even when someone's taking a spear from 2 seconds next to, from like so close to his head. So that's the point of the sleep is different. And maybe that's the point. But in terms of like the sleep itself, I don't know like what the difference is between those two types of sleep, maybe. But it does seem like the Midrash recognizes a difference there. Okay. So then the next piece I want to turn to is Nima, Lanum. So I mentioned at the outset, like part of how I got into this is this verse, Hinelu in source 6 here, Hinelu Yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael, the guardian of Israel neither sleeps neither slumbers nor sleeps. So again, when we're in the world of biblical poetry, like there's always words that repeat, and are the distinctions between those words important? You know, and when we have that type of repetition, like, does it actually signify anything? You know, it's hard to say. But when you have those two words, the words are meant to mean different things. So anyways, that's part of what just like got me down this rabbit hole. But the halakha really recognizes the difference between sleeping and nima. So let's see. We're going to see two examples where they play with that difference, and where they wonder about and debate about whether that difference actually exists. So the first one we're going to see is from Masachet Pesachim. And so in Masachet Pesachim here, we're talking about people who fell asleep at the Seder, because the Korban Pesach has to be eaten that night. And so if you fell asleep, can you wake up before the like end time for the Korban Pesach and keep eating? Or is the fact that you fell asleep signify that your Seder is over and you cannot continue eating for the Korban Pesach no matter what objective time it is? And this is, you know, falls in with a very interesting general sort of topic in Judaism about time, of like, is time defined by like a clock, the sun, the moon, or is clock defined by like me, my experience, my body? And all those things are obviously so interesting. And I love that the Jewish architecture of time makes space for sort of like all those things. Oh, and another option of like the community decided what time it is. So for example, like the community brought in Shabbat, therefore it's Shabbat. Doesn't matter if the sun didn't go down yet, you know? So like the personal, the objective, and the communal recognition of time, all like, in my opinion, so interesting. So in this case, that's a piece of it that's really driving, is like there's a personal sense of time, which is when you go to sleep, the night is over. Okay. Oh, and we see something similar to this in modern and like not modern, but like halacha that applies still today, is like if you, so on the shorter fasts, like the sunrise to sunset fasts, if you go to sleep, the halacha assumes that you are accepting the fast, unless you kind of articulate to yourself, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to want to fast, and I'm not accepting this fast with my going to sleep. Otherwise, you go to sleep, the fast is accepted, unless you kind of had like counter intention to not start the fast until later. So that's another place where going to sleep actually sort of sets a clock for like, you went to sleep, now it's tomorrow, basically, or like it now counts as tomorrow. So a similar thing plays out with the Korban Pesach. So here's the Mishnah, Yeshnu miksatan yuchelu. So some of the participants at the Seder fell asleep. They can eat from it when they wake up, because that was only some of this little sub community. So imagine like it's sort of like the equivalent of the communal times of Friday night. But kulan lo yochilu. But if everyone fell asleep, then no, we have like set it as tomorrow basically already, and you can't eat from it anymore. But here's Rabbi Yossi saying, so he's going to bring in our words. Rabbi Yossi Omer, nit nam nemu, if they doze, then they can eat from the Korban Pesach when they wake up, near Dimu, lo yochelu. But if they fell fast asleep, then they cannot. So notice that in the Tanakama of the Mishnah, you have this language of Yashan, and Rabbi Yossi then brings in Linamnim and Lehiradim as two other. He doesn't even engage with Yashan. He's like, so in the Tanakama's conception of sleep, it seems like from the Mishnah here, sleep is like an on or off switch. It's not the case that all of us have to fall asleep at the same time, but a person is either asleep or they're not asleep. Whereas Rabbi Yossi is like, no, sleep is way more complicated than that. I don't even know what like sleep is. I know what dozing is, and I know what deep sleep is. He totally rejects the idea that sleep is just like one thing that you're doing or you're not doing. He's like, no, sleep is complicated. So the Gemara dives into Rabbi Yossi's opinion and says, right, Rabbi Yossi Omer, nitnam nenu, yochlu, near demu lo yochilu, yochilu, near demu lo yochilu. So if they doze, they can eat it, but if they fell deeply asleep, they can't eat. And then asks, like, Rabbi Yossi, what do these words mean? Hechidami, nitnam name. What is dozing like? Like, what does that look like? And Rav Ashi explains nim vela nim, tir vela tir. It's kind of, I think, better than the words explanation. Like it sound just like taking that onomatopoeia for a second, right? The way nim below nim, tir below tir, the feeling of it is like, like just the way those words kind of like feel and sound. Asleep, not asleep, awake, not awake. But the words in Aramaic are just like amazing, I think. Okay, anyways. And then he goes into it more deeply. Rav Ashi continues, Kagon, Zakari leva ane. So if I said, hey, Maxine, you'd be like, I'm awake. Velo yada lahadure svara. But if I said to you, what's the answer to my question? You'd be like, I don't know. Wait, it's very familiar. We've all seen someone like that. Oh, I'm awake. Okay, no, so, and they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. The key, but the key, my kurulai, but when they say, Maxine, I was just asking you what your cat's name is, Midkar. Then Maxine is like, oh, sorry, yeah, of course. Okay, my cat's name is Turquoise. I just made up that you had a cat and that's its name. Okay. And then, okay, so first of all, I love that idea of like, what does it mean, linam nim? We have these categories, nim below nim, tir below tir. They call you, you answer, but you're disoriented, but you can get oriented. That's someone who is ninam nim. And I think the other thing that's interesting here is like in the Breshit Rabbah text, we had talked about sort of what's going on around you while you sleep as a determination of the nature of your sleep. So like maybe the difference between Adam's Tarzima and Shaul's Tarzima is actually like what they can tolerate happening near them potentially. And it seems like here, again, we have an outsider's judgment on what sleep looks like. And that's, again, not crazy because it's very difficult to have an insider's judgment on what sleep looks like. You know, some people are lucid dreamers and maybe they can do that better. But for the most part, it's very difficult to judge while you're sleeping what type of sleep you're having. And once you wake up, all you have are circumstances. Oh, I fell asleep when it was light out and now it's dark, or oh, I feel rejuvenated, or I didn't feel rejuvenated, right? When you ask someone how well they slept, it's almost never about the experience they were having while they were sleeping. It's almost always how they woke up and what they felt like when they woke up. So sleep is always discussed sort of like circumstantially or as like an outsider. Even if you're the outsider, it's still you judging your sleep not well from a state of awakeness. which is something that we're starting to really see happening here in a really kind of explicit way.
Yeah, so Miriam Smirnov had a question on this source, which is, is this like a spectrum or a binary? So are you kind of, yeah, I guess slipping between like Turdumu and Nidnamnu, or are those like kind of the same category and you're kind of going back and forth like?
That's a great question. So it seems like Rav Ashi would say it's a binary. But I think that, again, like I mentioned this at the top, I mentioned this before, and I'll definitely say it again. Like I think each of these texts are getting at it differently. And so I think Rav Ashi would say it's a binary, but it could be that Rav Yosef would have said it's a spectrum. Meaning it's curious that he cuts out Yashan altogether. Like I kind of wish we could be like, hey, Rav Yossi, like what does Yashan mean? But we don't have, like Mara doesn't ask that here, and we don't have access to that exactly. So yeah, I think that's definitely a question like to keep in your head of, is it a spectrum or is it a binary? That's a huge question for each of these sources. All right, so we have a little story now. We're going to see a few little stories in the next 10 minutes. So Abai have a yatev kame de Rabba. So Abai was sitting before Rabba, Chaza dekat namnim, and he saw that Rabba was dozing off. Rabba, by the way, is the teacher of Rava and Abaye, and we have stories about them like learning together when they're little. It's like very, very sweet, that relationship. So we don't know how old Abaye is in this story. Like he could be an adult or he could be like a 5-year-old, whatever. Okay, so he sees Rava dozing off. Amar le Meinam kana Mar. He said, are you sleeping? Amar le, and so Rava says back to him, Meinome ka mina mina mina, which is what that word is. um, um, he says, I'm dozing. Utnan nimnenu yochelu nirjamu lo yochelu. And we know from our Mishnah that if they doze, they can keep eating the Korban Pesach, and if they fall asleep, they can't. So a really cute little like pedagogy story, right? So I like to imagine that Abaye here is like towards the beginning of his education. Rava falls asleep. Abaye is like, Rava, are you sleeping? Like, imagine my 4-year-old like really getting into your face. And Rava is like, yes. And here's a Mishnah about that, which is just like, it's just awesome. It's just like an awesome pedagogical little moment. Like, oh, are you sleeping? Like, yes, let's learn a Mishnah together about sleeping. Okay, fantastic. But here we're gonna see in Sukkah. So Sukkah has a totally different thing, where in Sukkah, the ramifications of sleeping are, well, the stakes are you have to sleep inside the sukkah. So then they're gonna say, but with eating, you have 2 different categories of eating. You have achila arai, so you have casual eating, which you're allowed to do outside of the sukkah. But then if you're eating like a real eating, then you have to eat inside the sukkah. So they're like, perfect, you should be able to have casual sleeping outside of the sukkah, and then like real sleeping should happen inside the sukkah. So we're gonna see. I brought you the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. The Yerushalmi is just like they have the same vibe, but the Yerushalmi is just great. So Rabbi Elazar says, Achila arai ein shena arai. So Achila can be casual, but there's no such thing as casual sleep. So before we said, is it a spectrum? Is it a binary? Rabbi Elazar either thinks it's a spectrum, or he thinks, like the Tanakama, you're either asleep or you're not asleep, and there's not 2 different categories, which is what we saw Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah introducing. Chavraya Amrin, but they said back, the colleagues say back to Rabbi Elazar, what do you mean? Or they say, they explain maybe the reason of Rabbi Elazar, Shekena dam mishtakaya betoch shenato, because a person can sink into a sleep. Oh, I think I'm taking a nap, but then my nap lasts 11 hours and I wake up in the morning, right? So like that's whereas, oh, I'm having a snack. If your snack's going to turn into a meal, you're going to know about it, right? So if you're eating a snack and then you're like, oh, I'm really hungry, I want to eat more, then you're going to say to yourself, cool, that's so great. I want to eat more. Let's go to the sukkah. But if you're asleep and you're taking a nap and then you're like, oh, I'm actually so tired. Let me sleep for the next 11 hours. You're not going to be like, okay, but before we do that, let's get up and go to the sukkah because you're asleep. So that's the first reasoning here. But then Rabbi Eli actually offers a different reason. He says, Shekina dam yashin kim'a v'dayo. It's not the case. It's not like, oh, you take a nap and then surprise you slept 11 hours. It's actually, you could take a nap and that could be really sufficient sleep. Sometimes all you actually needed, you thought you were so tired, but really you just needed 20 minutes of sleep and that was sufficient for you. But Rabbi Ilah seems to be suggesting that because sleep is not judged by quantity rather than by quality, that's why ein shena arrives. Sleep cannot be casual. There's no such thing as like, oh, I'm just going to take a cat nap. It seems like because Rabbi Ilah thinks that if you wake up totally refreshed, it wasn't a cat nap. It wasn't shena arai. So actually the quality of your sleep, which can only be judged when you wake up, is the determining factor as to whether you're having like real sleep or not real sleep, which is also then like so interesting that there are, so Rabbi Ilah would say, there, I think actually both suggestions, Chavraya and Rabbi Ilah would both say there's different kinds of sleep, but it's out of your control and it's unknowable. And that's, again, a piece of the vulnerability and the scariness of sleep, both of these things, right? Like, so out of your control. I thought I was going to sleep for an hour. I woke up the next morning. Oh, I thought I was just going to sleep a little bit. And then I would like in 3 hours from now, go to sleep later tonight. But it turns out I took such a good Shabbos nap and fell into such a deep sleep that now I can't fall asleep later. And that's actually going to throw off my whole day on Sunday because it's 3 a.m. Motzei Shabbos and I'm still awake because I took such a good nap, right? Like just to make this like relatable, what's happening here. Okay, so the Gemara asks, Ma nafak min benehon, what is the difference between these opinions? Masar shenato la'acher. So what if you let another person control your sleep, i.e. you set an alarm, you ask Maxine to wake you up with her turquoise cat. So what's the difference between them? If you ask Maxine to wake you up. So if the problem is, oh, I might fall asleep and wake up 11 hours later, then great, that totally works. You can take a cat nap outside of your sukkah, so long as Maxine is going to come wake you up. But al date de Rabbi Ilah asur. But according to Rabbi Ilah, no, there's really no such thing. There's no such thing as shena arai. You cannot wake up. You would like. Or like you can't just like wake up before you fall into too deep of a sleep. You can't know what's gonna happen. There's no such thing as casual sleep. Maybe you'll sleep for 20 minutes and it'll power you for the next 10 hours. Like forget it. There's nothing you can do. This is a situation that has no redress. Okay. I think we're gonna put a pin in sukkah here. We're gonna pick up with our distinction between Nima and Shena and Tardima at the beginning of next week. So I just want to give you a little tour of what we're going to see. We're going to continue with the discussion of sukkah. It's like funny and silly a little bit, so definitely stay tuned. We're going to ask about if you would think there is a situation of Shena Arai. We're going to ask how long it is, and then we're going to describe sleeping like a horse. And then we're going to see that King David used to sleep like a horse a lot. So like, what is sleeping like a horse? And then we're going to see teachers who are teaching and everyone who's listening to them is falling asleep, which is what I always try and prevent in my shiurim. Okay, so we'll call it here for now. And hopefully people will come back next week. We will continue and we'll do some other good stuff too. So next week we're going to really dig into like, is sleep good or bad kind of question, which obviously will continue for the next bunch of shiurim. But today we didn't really talk about that. We just talked about what are the different types of sleep without value judgments.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna, and thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. This week is the beginning of Sfirazman. Classes meet Sunday through Thursday. at all times of day. Highlights include Mishnah in depth, and that's going to be taught by Rabbi Avi Wallfish, Sundays at 1:30. We're on Masechet Sota now. Law and Practice in Early Judaism on Tuesdays at 12:30 with Dr. Malka Simkovich, and discussions on the Parsha this week with Ms. Sophia Stepansky at 12:30. Oh, is that this coming week or was it earlier today? Whoops. Okay. And I'm putting a link in the chat where you can sign up for those and more classes. So looking forward to seeing you next week, and have a good sleep tonight.